A pretty impressive win for Pitt yesterday as the Panthers advance from the ACC tournament quarterfinals with a 12-point win over Wake Forest. They move on to face North Carolina, the number 1 seed in the conference tournament tonight. And boy, we got a lot to say about this. I mean, we're going to keep it to around our usual 20 minutes, but I think there's a whole lot to talk about coming out of that win over Wake Forest yesterday. Ishmael Leggett's performance, Blake Henson just sort of quietly dropping 20 points like it's no big deal. Defense, mighty team defense for sure. And maybe the best thing to come out of yesterday's game, to be completely honest with you, maybe the best thing. I talked about it yesterday in the postgame show. I'm going to talk about it again here today and a bunch of other topics as well on the Morning Pitt and youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's a Friday edition of the Morning Pitt and youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Normally Fridays, as I always say, it'd be our mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt where we take the questions from the Pitt fans on Panther-Lair.com, but no, we can't do that. Not when there was a game yesterday. Not when there was plenty to talk about from that game. I mean, there aren't typically Thursday games. But if there is a Thursday game, we have to talk about that game here on the Morning Pitt. And particularly when that Thursday game leads to the opportunity to play a game on Friday, we absolutely have to talk about it right here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to recap that win over Wake Forest yesterday, some of the things that stood out the most, what meant the most to me about that game, and a whole lot of other topics related to Pitt basketball as they move on to the semifinals of the ACC tournament. Of course, you know what we always ask you to do. Like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com is the place where we put all of our Pitt video content, whether it's these daily Morning Pitt videos Monday through Friday, whether it's our weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night, or our post-game shows that we do after every road basketball game, or in the case of this week, every neutral court basketball game. We went live after the Wake Forest game yesterday, had a great talk for 45 minutes or so. We will be live after the North Carolina game tonight. That one's scheduled for a 7 p.m. tip-off, thinking we'll probably start around 9 or 9:15, hopefully not too much later than that. All while keeping an eye on the other semifinal game as it's going on. But we will be live after the game tonight to talk about what we see out of Pitt, Carolina, just like we were live last night to talk about what we saw out of Pitt, Wake Forest. These live post-game shows are always some of the most fun things that we do. And one of the best parts is that, you have the chat screen over there where you can comment. You can get in the chat. You can add your comments and questions. We'll respond to your comments and answer your questions to talk about the game. It's fun to do it on Wednesday nights as well, just sort of general topics, whatever's going on, we talk about it then. But after the game is especially fun because everybody's fired up, everybody's excited about the game, win or lose, and everybody's got something to say. And so we give you a little bit of a platform. It's like an old school call-in talk show. You know what I mean? A call-in show, post-game show. The only difference is we can't hear your voice, but we like to imagine what your voice sounds like. So you can, we all have our own imaginations as far as that goes. But you don't want to miss it. You want to be part of the live show, so make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And while you're at it, like this video, because that's always cool to see as well. So, and the website. You thought I was going to forget. Panther-Lair.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, and recruiting. You find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans. All day, every day, Pitt fans are hanging out at Panther-Lair.com. Pittsburgh.rivals.com. So, Pitt 81, Wake Forest 69. Pretty nice performance from the Panthers in this one. You sit down to record something, to talk about the game that happened yesterday when you've already done a post-game show about it. You've already been writing a ton of stuff about it. You've been interacting on the message boards and Twitter and all these different places about it. And you almost do I even need to recap it? And we really don't need to recap the game right here because you watched the game. And if you didn't watch the game, you caught up on it later. You know what happened. You know that Pitt jumped out to a 12-point lead at halftime. You know that they pushed that lead to 19 around 6, almost 7 minutes into the second half, excuse me. And then Wake Forest went on a run, whether you want to call it a 20-6 run, a 19-4 run, or 16-4 run, whatever it came down to. The end result was that Pitt was up 19, 55-36, and then Pitt was up 3, 65-62. So I guess that's a 26-10 run for Wake Forest, if you want to look at it that way. what really happened was Pitt made only like 2 out of 10 field goals, and over that same stretch, Wake Forest made 8 out of 10. So Pitt attempted 10 and missed 10. Wake Forest attempted 10 and made 10. And that's a good way to cut into a lead of any size, and certainly even one that's 19 points. Ultimately, it was too deep of a hole for Wake Forest to dig out of. And ultimately, Pitt was able to, I think they made their final 3 field goal attempts in the game. Wake Forest missed their final 4 field goal attempts in the game. Was there contact on some of those plays? Could fouls have been called on some of those plays? Yes, but that applies to the entire game. This was a game where the officials swallowed the whistles for the most part. Certainly in the first half, when only 9 fouls were called. There were quite a bit more in the second half. I believe 27 total is what the number of fouls that were called in the second half. Although a decent, at least a handful of those were called in the last minute or two on Wake Forest when the Deacons were fouling intentionally. But Pitt was able to make plays down the stretch. They were able to hold on and keep the lead, never giving up the lead. Wake Forest never led in this game. They tied it a few times. They tied it at 7-7. They tied it at 12-12. Didn't tie it again after that. And the closest they got was 3 points. 64 was the last one. That was with about 3.5 minutes to go. They had it at 3 points. 65-62 with about 4 minutes to go. But Pitt was able to hold on. Of course, the main driver behind that performance, or behind the team performance, was the individual performance of Ishmael Leggett. 30 points, a career high. The second time a Pitt player has ever scored 30 points in an ACC tournament game. The most points scored by a reserve for any team in the ACC tournament since 2017, and just an overall unbelievably good performance from Ishmael Leggett. Ishmael Leggett was awesome in this game, and the stats absolutely back it up. There's no lying about these stats. 30 points on 11 of 18 shooting. He was 6 of 6 from the free throw line in the second half, scored 19 points in the second half, 6 of 10 from the field, 6 of 6 from the free throw line. He finished the game with 8 rebounds, no turnovers, and 5 steals, which I think I read it tied an ACC tournament record. Wait, I had that. No, it is an ACC tournament record. It's set an ACC tournament record. Ishmael Leggett did with his 5 steals. And so just an all-around outstanding performance. It really was. It was his best performance of the season, and if not for Blake Henson scoring 41 in a game this year, it would have been the best performance of any Pitt player this season. And who knows, given the setting and what was on the line, this might have been the best performance by a Pitt player this season, although, I'm going to probably go with the 41-point game from Blake Henson. But Ishmael Leggett wasn't the only one. Well, before we move on from Ishmael Leggett, the thing about how Ishmael Leggett played yesterday, it was not just that he scored 30 points. That's obviously the biggest part. But it wasn't just that. It was how he scored. Time after time, driving through contact, finishing very difficult layups where a lesser man, a more intimidated man, a less physical player, a less tough player would not have been able to finish through it. Well, would not have maybe even attempted to try to get through the contact that Ishmael Leggett absorbed. But time and time again, he kept driving. And time again, he kept getting to the basket, and he kept finishing. And he kept scoring. And there really wasn't anything Wake Forest could do about it. There was nothing surprising. Wake Forest knows that's what Ishmael Leggett's game is. And if they didn't know that, then about 10 minutes into the game, they knew it because he had done it a handful of times already by then. But they still couldn't really stop it. And part of that is how you have to defend Pitt when there are so many three-point shooters on the perimeter. Blake Henson's out there. You've got to keep an eye on him. Bob Carrington and Jalen Lowe can make shots from outside. You've got to keep an eye on them. And Zach Austin even is a bit of a threat. Guillermo Diaz-Graham is a threat. You have to watch those guys. And so you can't just completely pack it in and defend the lane when a guy like Leggett wants to drive, or if a guy like Lowe wants to drive. And I actually think Jalen Lowe could have driven more yesterday than he did. He obviously ended up with 5 assists, and so he did a pretty good job distributing. I don't think there's any question about that. But I actually thought he had opportunities as a lefty where he could have gone to his left. There was a slight opening there, either as a defensive lapse on Wake Forest, or just an opportunity that presented itself, and he didn't, the window opened a little bit, but he didn't take it. So we'll see if that's something he works on or tries to work a little bit more tonight when he faces North Carolina. But Leggett, had opportunities, and no matter how much they would collapse on him once he got into the paint, it just wasn't enough. He was at his craftiest, his toughest, his most physical, and his just most, just most relentless, I guess is probably the best word to describe how Ishmael Leggett played yesterday. And that's just on the offensive end, because the second big storyline, and it's not that far behind Ishmael Leggett's individual performance, was Pitt's defense as a team, individually and collectively, against Wake Forest. I mean, Wake Forest is a good offensive team. I don't think there's any question about it. I think their last game against Pitt, the game at Wake Forest where they beat Pitt by 30, I think that was a game of extremes. I think I said this on the Morning Pitt yesterday, that Pitt played their worst game of the season by a number of measurable, statistics. And Wake Forest played its best game of the season by a number of measurable statistics. But I said those were two extremes, and I didn't expect the extremes to repeat themselves again. But Wake Forest is still a good offensive team, even if they don't get to the extremes of that last game that Pitt and Wake Forest face each other in the regular season. They're still a good offensive team. They still can score. And they still have Hunter Salas, who was a first-team All-ACC selection, one of the best players in the conference, a guy who averages 18 points per game. And that makes them dangerous. And I thought the defensive effort on Salas in particular, and I think there were a number of standout defensive efforts yesterday, but the defense on Salas in particular, he scored 15 points. He was 5 of 9 from the floor. He made 3 of 6 from 3. He had 4 rebounds, 4 assists. He had 5 turnovers, but it wasn't even just that. I mean, it was that, but it wasn't just that. It was how Pitt defended him, and that was largely Bub Carrington and Ishmael Leggett. Now, he made 5 field goals. That's on the low end for Salas, but he's had 13 or 14 games where he's made 5 or fewer field goals this season, so it's not totally out of the ordinary. What is rather unique is that he only attempted 9 shots. And I think he only had 3 or 4 other games this season when he took fewer than 10 shots in a game. That, to me, is the notable number. Because while, yes, he had 5 turnovers, and Ishmael Leggett had some of those, Bub Carrington, what Carrington and Leggett really did when they were guarding Salas one-on-one is they prevented him from doing anything he wanted to do. They rendered him, I don't want to say a non-factor, because he drew a lot of attention, obviously, and those guys had to be very focused on Hunter Salas. But he was, to a certain extent, a non-factor. He was a non-shooting factor. He had 4 field goal attempts in the first half because they just denied him any opportunities. To some extent, they denied him the ball. But even when he had the ball, Carrington's defense was so on point, and Leggett's defense was so on point that he was unable to really get anything going. And I think that was huge. I think that was absolutely huge. I think that had a ton to do with that win. And if Pitt can carry that defense over to tonight against North Carolina, which is going to be an even taller task than it was against Wake Forest, then they're going to have a legitimate chance to win again. I would even go so far as to say that if they do win tonight, it will likely be a result of the defense. I believe this Pitt team can score. But if they're going to beat North Carolina, they're going to have to defend with the intensity and the energy and the intention and the focus that they had yesterday against Wake Forest. Because they came out from the very start playing very hard on defense. Both teams did. And Pitt started finding cracks in Wake Forest's defense. Wake Forest was not really able to consistently do it, not as consistently as Pitt did throughout the game. Pitt's going to have to play that kind of defense tonight. I thought Federico did a good job on Efton Reed. Reed still had 12 points, 5 of 6 shooting, and 5 rebounds, which I think the rebounding number is pretty notable. But I thought Federico did a good job not getting pushed around by Efton Reed. It's certainly not getting pushed around the way he had gotten pushed around in the first 2 games. I thought he did a good job of responding to the physical play, of being physical himself, and really standing his ground. Reed had so many easy baskets, particularly in that first game, the one at the Peterson Event Center, when Federico was guarding him. But I didn't feel like that was the case yesterday. I felt like Reed had to really work to get his baskets. 4 or 5 inside the arc. He made the 3, but 4 or 5, close to the rim. And he finished on those. I mean, obviously he shot 5 of 6 overall, 4 of 5 from 2. But it wasn't nearly as easy. And I think that's encouraging. I think Federico should take a lot of confidence and encouragement out of that game as he goes into another huge matchup tonight against Armando Bacot. A matchup that we saw go a certain way last year at a game played in Chapel Hill. This game tonight won't be in Chapel Hill, but I think it's probably safe to assume there's going to be a decent amount of North Carolina fans in attendance for this game. And, I'll be honest, there's a part of me that thinks that's ideal. There's a part of me that thinks that if this crowd is decidedly pro-UNC, that's not the worst thing. It's first game of the ACC tournament semifinals. It's a 7 o'clock tip-off. There should be a pretty big crowd for this game. The Pitt Wake Forest crowd was announced at 14,000. I mean, I guess. I don't know. It felt pretty sparse just watching on TV or on the stream. But I think tonight's game, as a primetime game and an ACC tournament semifinal game featuring one of the ACC's premier brands, I think there's going to be a big crowd there. And I think that crowd is probably going to be heavily tilted toward North Carolina. And I think that is great for Pitt. I really do think that's good for Pitt. I mean, we all know how well Pitt has played on the road this season. And I don't think that's a fluke. I think there are some things behind it. I think this team does like being the enemy. I think this team does like having everyone against them. Not that they prefer it to having all the fans behind them like they do with the Zoo and the Peterson Event Center, but I think they like having fans against them. I asked Ishmael Leggett about this earlier this week when we talked to Leggett and Blake Henson and Jeff Cable before the team left for the ACC tournament. And we were talking about the culture of the team, and Leggett was talking about how they're tight-knit and they're a brotherhood, and they really do support each other and all this. And he got asked about, playing on the road. And I asked him, on the road, I said, do you feel like that brotherhood, that tight-knit sense, in the locker room helps you guys on the road, where you're out of your comfort zone, you don't have the fans behind you, but because you guys have that tight bond, you're able to, that it helps you play in that kind of environment. And he said, absolutely. He said, we get to a spot where, everybody's against us. It's us against the world. It's us versus them. And, we're able to rely on each other, and we know we can count on each other. And we have that sort of, that bond, that tightness. I said this on the post-game show yesterday. It's a 2024 version of We All We Got, basically. That these guys, I think, believe in each other. They believe in themselves. And when they get into these tough road environments, they know they can count on each other. And I think that's part of why they've been so successful, is because of how tight they are, how close they are, how strong those bonds are. And so I think if they get into a situation tonight where everybody's getting fired up about UNC, not only do I think they'll be ready for it, I think they'll embrace it. And I think it'll feed them. It'll definitely feed Blake Henson. If you guys haven't seen our good friend Kelly Burkett from WPXI sat down with Blake Henson at some point, in the last week or two, and she asked him about the Duke game. And his anecdote, what he related about the Duke game, the one at Cameron, was that at the beginning of the game, it seemed very strange to him during like warm-ups and stuff that it almost seemed like the Duke fans were being friendly, like they were being too nice, and he doesn't like that. He said I don't like it when I don't like being liked by the enemy. He said, so I made a promise that I was going to make them hate me by the end of the game, and I think we would all agree that he was successful in that goal, but. I think this whole team has that kind of us versus them, us against the world mentality, and that comes from the bonds that the team is sort of built on. So I think that'll work in their favor. All right, the last thing I want to say about yesterday's game, and I said this during the post-game show yesterday, and I really believe it, that and it only hit me after the game, maybe during the post-game show, that it really kind of dawned on me. Maybe one of the best things about yesterday's game was that we could finally, for 2 hours, just watch basketball. We didn't have to talk and think about non-conference strength of schedule and net rankings and quad wins and the bubble and bracketology and all these other things we've spent the last 5 days, going over and over and over about. Ever since the NC State game ended, we talked about it on Sunday. We talked about it on Monday. We talked about it on Tuesday, on Wednesday. We talked about it all day yesterday until the game actually started. But once the game started, and I know Shulman and Billis on the broadcast talked about it at different points, and that's fine. I mean, that's part of it. That's part of their job, and they have to bring that up for context. But I didn't really pay any attention to it. Like, as they were talking about it, I really didn't think about it very much because there was a game. And we could just watch basketball. And I'm sort of carrying that vibe over to today. I just say I'm carrying that vibe over to today. You know what? I did. I did say that. And I do believe it. Because Pitt just played a game yesterday. And they played really well. They looked great for 27 minutes. They had to fight like crazy to hold on for the final 13. And they won. They got an unbelievable performance from Ishmael Leggett. They got a great performance from Blake Henson. They got great defense from Bub Carrington. They got great facilitation by Jalen Lowe. I mean, they just had a really good game. And it didn't matter who they played in November. And it didn't matter how they scheduled their non-conference. And it didn't matter how many quad wins, although they got another quad one win yesterday by beating Wake Forest. None of those things mattered. The bubble didn't matter. It was just a basketball game, and you could watch a basketball game. And now there's a huge game tonight. And yeah, it's got bubble implications. It absolutely has NCAA tournament implications. But I don't care. I'm not going to pay attention. And I mean, call me out on this when I tweet about it in an hour. But I'm not. My goal for today is to not pay attention to anything Joe Lunardi says or anything any bracketologist says. And that's not any disrespect to those guys. I appreciate what they do. I read what they do. I follow it all year long. Right now, I don't care. I don't. Pitt won a really good game yesterday. Played really well and got a big win. And they got a chance for an even bigger one tonight. And all of that other stuff, movement up and down and the bubble and all that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter right now. All that matters is can they go out and beat such a good rant ruined by calling North Carolina Notre Dame. Damn. Well, I'm not going to start it over. So we're not going to re-record. I hardly... The only time I ever re-record is when I screw up the intro and end up tripping over my words, blah, 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 that kind of thing. And then I restart. This far in, 22, 23 minutes in, we're not restarting anything. They played a great game yesterday. They have got a big win yesterday. They have an opportunity for an even bigger win tonight. And that's all I'm going to think about today. Pitt, North Carolina. And that's pretty cool. It's a pretty good place to be, and it should be a lot of fun to watch this game. Whatever happens in this game tonight will be live after the game, so make sure you tune in right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com for the post-game show. It's going to be after 9 o'clock, so it's a Friday night. It's 9 o'clock. You know what that means. I mean, we did a shot yesterday, and it was only 5:30 in the evening, but it was a little after 5, actually. But, that old saying, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. It was 5 o'clock right here. And certainly tonight, it's going to be that time. Win or lose, it's going to be time for a shot or two. So we'll have a good time on tonight's postgame show. So hopefully you can tune in. If you want to make sure you don't miss it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Like this video as well, and then head over to Panther-Lair.com. Jim Hammett is in D.C. providing lots of great coverage from the ACC tournament, so make sure you go check out what he's producing. We'll have our game previews and everything throughout the day today. 3-2-1 column coming up a little bit later this morning. Got a lot of good stuff for you. I like to think we have a lot of good stuff for you. Hopefully you enjoy it as well. So I hope you've had a great week so far. Just counting down the hours from now until 7 o'clock tonight for Pitt, North Carolina. I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure you are as well. So enjoy your Friday. Until then, we'll talk to you tonight on the live Panther-Lair postgame show right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.